Hello everyone, welcome back to Max's Book Club, Part 2. Crazy enough, that means I've read 3 books since last time. We have a special guest this time. Jack is behind the camera. You can go follow him on TikTok at...
No.
They can't?
Actually, no, you're right, yeah.
What's your TikTok?
Swaggiest of boys.
I have a new mic. If this sounds really crisp, then that's because of this little guy. And if it sounds like trash, it's because I don't know how to use it. One main criticism I got from last time, mostly from and only from my mom, was that the video was too long and I rambled too much. She said that people my age wouldn't watch a video that long. Let's just say my friends watched it and she didn't. So, okay, boomer, right? But I did take some notes and I wrote some notes about the 3 books that I read this time, so that I won't just ramble on with and trying to come up with stuff. I already have some ideas written down. Yes, Jack?
Is there a theme, a common theme between the 3 books?
There is no common theme. I just read 3 books and then I'm talking about them. That's Max's Book Club. Yep.
For future episodes, would you not want a common theme? I feel like that would make more sense.
For this episode, I prepared some books that I'm going to read in the future, which are over here. I'm going to tell them about some books, and then if they read them at the same time as me, then we can converse about them in the comments. Interesting. So let's just jump into it. I talked about this book a little bit in the last Max's Book Club video because I had started reading it, but the first book I finished was Stephen King's The Shining. This was a really great book. Just like I said in the last video, I wanted to read it because I had seen the movie, and the book is really good in its own way. So the movie's great, but the book is much longer it has more content than the movie. It's really interesting to see like what wasn't in the movie and what was in the movie, but I'm not going to talk about that too much. What I am going to do is put a comment down below if you want me to make a video specifically about how the movie The Shining and the book The Shining compare, and my thoughts about both and how they compare and stuff like that. You can like that comment. If I get 3 likes on that comment, I'll make a video eventually. But yeah, this book was really cool. It wasn't super scary, I want to say. Like there were some parts at the very end, like near the climax, that were like, it really takes you, like it holds you, you're super into it, but it's not super scary. What is really, really amazing about this book and about, I guess, Stephen King in general, not that I've read other books by him, but what's really amazing is the character development and how he gets into like sort of justifying how the people in the story, and notably Jack Torrance, for everyone who's seen the movie, how he becomes like crazy over time, and how he has like, it also covers like he's an alcoholic. And I think the way it depicts his addiction and how he deals with that and sort of the guilt and stuff seems very like realistic and like true to what I've heard like addiction is like in real life. So I think that was a really well thought out character in the book. Yes?
Whose perspective is it written from?
Oh, that's actually a good point, because although the book in general is like written in the 3rd person, like it's not from any specific perspective, The Shining itself is a like power that their kid has, which is like he can basically read thoughts and like read the future and stuff like that. And there's other characters in the book that like they can communicate with their thoughts and stuff like that, but the kid is the most powerful. And what the narrator does is actually, and it took me a while to realize this, but each chapter is sort of written from one of the characters' perspective, interestingly. And he doesn't say like, oh, from the kid's perspective or from Jack's perspective. He sort of, you see that basically some of the thoughts are written in parentheses. Like, wait, let me find if I can see they'll have normal narration and then it'll cut in with like a parenthesis, and that'll be like a certain character's thoughts. And it's really interesting because you then get like perspective, like how one character is seeing what another character is doing, and it's not just like describing what's happening. So that's really cool. One little side note is there's a surprising, I want to say a surprising number of uses of the N-word. There is one black character in this book. It seems like every other character, not every character, but I mean, it is used in like it to show negatively, like everyone who is like bad calls him the N-word, but it's like, it was like an unsettling number of N-words in one book. But other than that, it's a great book. I do recommend it. And if you really like the movie, I think you can really like the book because it's really good. And it sort of goes into some of the aspects that the movie glosses over really well. There we go. Jack?
What's one thing you took from the book? Like what's one thing you took away from it? What would you say that is?
One thing I would take from the book is, well, that's hard. I guess one thing that it talks about is how the present is affected by the past and the future sort of thing. I guess one thing that I might take from it very generally is, I don't see how I could take something from that, but I thought that was another interesting aspect about how like the past influences the present, and so it's sort of like would you want to repeat the past? I guess that's an interesting thing, because like Jack Torrance sees something that happened in the past and sort of like imitates it, and that's like part of how he becomes crazy. He just like goes crazy the same way someone else did in the past, and so it's like, don't repeat the errors of the past. That's what I'll take from it. There we go. Moving on to book 2, and this I got for Christmas. Christmas was 4 days ago, and this is book 2. I've read 2 whole books since Christmas, which is a crazy amount of reading. Thank you, Jack, for clapping. As I said in the last video, I started reading in an effort to become a better person, which is, and because reading is unheard of for me. And now I've read 2 books in the span of 4 days. What is going on? Right. So, book number 2 is Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. Came out this year, I think. I'd never read a Malcolm Gladwell book because I didn't really read, but this was super interesting. It's a very dense book, but very generally it talks sort of deeply about, it's not fiction, it's like, I don't know how you would, it's sort of like a long essay that he writes about a subject, and this subject is talking to strangers, and he sort of covers all of the issues that arise in interactions between strangers, and that is like a very general. It's not like just like, oh, I meet a stranger in the street and what goes back about that, but it's like things with like the Black Lives Matter movement and like how issues happen, like how a white cop and a black civilian interact and how that goes badly, and even situations where you have like 2 strangers who meet at a party and it ends in like a rape, and how like that sort of evolves, and sort of the stuff like even things like he talks about certain cases of pedophilia.
It's definitely pedophilia.
And how those sort of go, in a lot of cases, it goes like unreported or fixed for so long, and like why that happens. And there's also like some really random, like really insightful examples. For example, Chamberlain, I don't know what his first name, I can't remember. He was a British guy in the past around World War II, and he went to talk to Hitler before World War II to sort of like feel out what the situation was like. And he came back thinking, oh, Hitler, he has crazy ideas, but he's a pretty trustworthy guy. I don't think we have any problems with him. And sort of it talks about, yeah, how someone can get a character so wrong from a conversation with him, basically. Sort of throughout, it talks about all these examples, but to explain a specific case, which is the case of Sandra Bland, who was a black woman who was pulled over by a white cop. And this is a case that he introduces the book with, and then ends the book with like using all the stuff that he explained. Like he explains how that situation like sort of happened and what went wrong and what we can fix about that and stuff. But she was pulled over by a white cop for not using a turn signal, and then she got pissed off because he was basically like pulling her over for like just that. And then she lit a cigarette because she was stressed out because she had been pulled over many times before, and he told her to put it out, even though she wouldn't have really had to in general, but it sort of escalated. He eventually asked her to get out of the car, arrested her, and she went to jail for 3 days until she commits suicide in jail, which is a really terrible situation. And so it sort of tries to explain through a bunch of examples like all that went wrong in that situation. And so some of the concepts generally that he talks about, one is called the concept of defaulting to truth, which is a thing that like humans do apparently, which is where they by default accept something to be true until there is so much evidence against it that they can no longer accept it to be true. So an example being, so one thing, for example, he talks about is double agents, and how like he talks about these cases where between the US and Cuba, the CIA had like 60 agents in Cuba, and turns out all of them were double agents working for Cuba under Fidel Castro, and it was a crazy situation. But basically everyone assumed that because it was easier to believe that they weren't double agents than that they were. Everyone sort of, it's hard to explain, but he explains it very well, so I recommend the book. And another concept he talks about, moving right along, another concept he talks about is sort of the trouble we have in deciphering strangers. And he talks about something he calls the Friends Fallacy based on the show Friends. And he talks about how if you were to mute an episode of Friends, you could basically get all that's happening from it just from the facial expressions because they're so emotive, and the way they act is so, their facial emotions are so close to what people expect to be. Basically, if someone is supposed to be confused, they look super confused in their face, or if they're scared, they look scared, etc. And he talks that about certain people who, and this happens a lot, people that don't conform to those like standards. And that's why it's the Friends Fallacy, is that people will assume that everyone does and that the emotions that people show are equivalent to the emotions they're feeling, but in reality, oftentimes that's not the case. And he talks about one example about Amanda Knox, I believe, Knox. I actually saw a tweet by Dr. Phil talking about it just today, crazy enough. But she was this girl who had a roommate who was murdered. She was studying abroad and her roommate was murdered. And just because she wasn't reacting the right way after it all happened, like she was sort of laughing, she was uneasy, so she didn't look like sad and like looking down and stuff like that as you would expect someone to be. She ended up being convicted for the murder and she was sent to jail even though she had nothing to do with it, just because people were like, oh, she's acting weird, she's not acting the way people should, therefore she must be guilty. And it's sort of this like weird thing that we expect people to act the way they feel, but that's not the case, and you shouldn't be sent to jail for just not seeming sad when you should be. So it was a bunch of these like concepts where it's like confusion between strangers and why these things happen, and all the cases that he talks about are like super relevant and super interesting. Like I talked about like a rape, and he talked about like the biggest rape case recently, which was about the Brock Turner and like that whole situation, how that happened, the effect of like alcohol in that situation, stuff like that. I think it was just a really interesting, like just in general, the way he covers all these cases was really interesting. Great book. I recommend it. Jack?
You get, like, what's something you got away, that you took away from it?
I think, I sort of what he's telling us to do when reading this is, I think, just to be sort of more mindful about our interactions and don't. A big thing he says, for example, is like, because people do default to truth, as I was talking about, you shouldn't attack people for doing that, because that's like how people are wired. And I think a lot of people will criticize someone if like, oh, if they're found out that they didn't realize that someone was a double agent, they must be stupid. But since everyone would normally default to truth, you shouldn't do that. And sort of, just in general about all these cases, it's about being more mindful about things. Just talking about it, I'm thinking of other cases he talks about. He talks about like specifically like policing in the US, how like the sort of way of pulling people over to check their cars and stuff was sort of, that idea was brought about, and how it was used very successfully in areas that were sort of like had very high crime rates. And unfortunately, those concepts that worked really well in a certain area were then just assumed to work very well in all areas, even though the person that created those ideas, I'm talking in very general terms because I don't want to make a video too long. Basically, the person that made up this concept of the way to police didn't want it to be applied to all situations, because it doesn't work that way, and people have applied it to all situations, which is why we had a random white cop pulling over Sandra Bland, and then for no apparent reason, like, yeah, she didn't have her turn signal, but why he needed to pull her over for that when it was like not a very dangerous thing and stuff like that. Yeah, anyway, it's a great book. Yes?
Do you think your future interactions with people are going to be affected by this book, or basically that?
I think it's going to be hard to like always think, like, be mindful about my interactions, but I definitely, I think it's enlightened me about a lot of things and how like people do deal with things. I would say yes and no, like not all my interactions, but I think I might be able to see certain interactions in a different light. But yeah. Cool. So now moving on to book number 3, and this was the book I read yesterday and the day before, and this is a book I bought for my mom for Christmas, and I ended up reading it. Aren't those the best gifts, the ones you get for someone else and then you use? And this is a book by Marie Kondo. and it's called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. So if you guys have seen Marie Kondo's show on Netflix, she tidies up houses, and that doesn't sound super interesting, but it really is. She's devised this whole philosophy around tidying called the KonMari philosophy, named after her. I really like the show. It's kind of funny because it's also like reality TV show-y, in that they like interview people that are full-on hoarders with huge piles of clothes on their bed, and how she helps them through that. But yeah, and this book is sort of like her philosophy, but written down. So the philosophy basically broken down into two general concepts. Is one is getting rid of stuff. People think like tidying up is all about like, oh, how to organize what you have, but a big part of her philosophy is also about learning how to get rid of things. And she basically, I can't remember who the Greek philosopher is who came up with this, but like, you know, the concept of like, if you keep asking like why about certain things, like, well, why do I want this job? Why? And you think like, oh, to make more money. Why do I want more money? It always comes to the question, or to the answer, I want to be more happy. Like that's the final answer. And sort of what she says is, she uses that in tidying and thinking, for each item, you have to take it in your hand and think, does this item spark joy, is what she says. So, and that's the way to, in the end, really know if you need to keep something or get rid of it. And she really emphasizes that getting rid of stuff is just as, if not more important than the tidying up that comes afterwards. I'm losing my breath, I'm talking too much. And then of course, there's the second half, which is about how to organize certain things. In both cases, both in getting rid and in organizing, the interesting thing is like she organizes by category. So for example, you'll take clothes as one category, and she talks about that as opposed to like organizing a room. Because for example, in a household, you might have things of the same category, but throughout your household. And if you're organizing by room, then you're never gonna know like all the things that you have in that category, and if you have too many of certain things, and if you're spread out and things like that. And yeah, and then sort of at the end of the book, in the last chapter, there's 5 main chapters. It's a 200-page book. It's not a super long read, but in the last main chapter, she talks about sort of the philosophy and like philosophically, like how she came up with her philosophy. And she talks about like what tidying up, like what effect it can have on your life in general, and what effect it had on her clients. And it really was interesting to see, like, what's cool is like, you know, she's Japanese, and it's sort of like the new feng shui, and she talks about it that way, where it's like, hi, this is Max editing. I looked up, feng shui is Chinese. I'm a dumbass, sorry. But she talks about it. Okay. So, yeah. Back to the video. It's sort of getting rid of things and knowing everything that has a place in your house. It sort of allows you to grow personally, because you're not surrounded by items that you don't want or don't need, or you don't have like space, but it's just, it allows you to grow as a person and move forward in life. And she gives a bunch of examples of what her clients were able to do after cleaning their homes using her methods, and it's really great.
Why read the book rather than just watch the show?
I guess the book is sort of a better summary of everything. In the show, you'll get parts of her philosophy in each episode, but you're never going to get the complete idea. So the show is an easier to digest way to get her ideas, and you can get some of them and sort of apply them little by little. But I think the book definitely does a better job of showing like sort of the why to do all these things. Like the show sort of showed like, oh, if you do this, these are the results, but this is more like why she devised her philosophy in this way. Yeah, it's more theoretical, and it's just, yeah, I mean, it's more in depth also, obviously. You have 200 pages based on just that, and versus like a show which also shows interactions between people and like getting rid of stuff and things like that. I thought this was a really good read, and I'm gonna try and apply the concepts to my life and my living situation. And if I'm gonna put another comment down below, if you would like to see me in a video tidy up my room using her concepts, like that comment, and we'll see if I get likes on that. I'll do that. But I definitely recommend this book. It's an easy read, it's pretty short, and it's really great if you want to know how you can make your living situation more enjoyable.
The first question is, which was the easiest read?
What's interesting is like all three of them are different in that they're like completely different genres. I can never say that word. They're completely different genres of genres genres of books as well. If you're just looking to have a story, The Shining was probably the easiest, although it's very long. The Marie Kondo book, I don't know, is short, and so in that sense, it's also an easy read. I would say the Malcolm Gladwell book was probably the hardest read in that it's like a lot of heavy concept. I mean, just from talking about it, you could see that it covers a lot of very heavy topics with a lot of like theoretical like explaining around it. So it's not an easy read by any means, but it's super interesting as well.
If your viewers only have time to read one of the three books, which one would you recommend?
I think I would say the Marie Kondo book, because just reading it, I mean, I only finished it today, but I feel like that's the book that can have the biggest impact on you. I guess the Malcolm Gladwell book can also be more, you can learn probably more from it. Hard to say.
For you personally, of the three, which are you like the happiest that you've read?
Which one do I think I took the most out of? I would say the Malcolm Gladwell book, just because it's an essay about like a very specific topic going into cases very deeply. It just makes sense that I would get more out of that than like book about, you know, a horror story, but not to detract from the other books either, because I don't think that's their intention was not to teach me a bunch of stuff either, you know. I think now what I'm gonna do is to go into more of the book club portion of this. I'll talk about some of the books that might be coming up and that I might read in the future. I have a small list. I had some suggestions in the last video, so if you want to suggest books, comment down below. Or if you have opinions about the books I talked about today, also let me know. I think one of the books I'm gonna be reading is this massive freaking brick, which was given to me by my brother Jack, and it's Alan Turing, The Enigma, by Swaggiest of Boys, of course. So Alan Turing, The Enigma by Andrew Hodges. This was the book that inspired The Imitation Game, which is a great movie if you like good movies, but also if you're into computers like I am. But it is a big book, which is why I didn't read it right now, because I wanted to get episode 2 out. Another book I'm really excited about is this big book by Haruki Murakami, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. I've wanted to read a book by him for a while. I wasn't sure which one to start with because there are so many. When I went to the bookstore, there were like a ton. And I read online that this was a good one to start with. It's big, so I haven't started it yet, but I think this might be the book that I read next. I'm going on a plane tomorrow, so I might read this then. My mom said she really loved this book, so I'm gonna give it a try as well. It's called In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick. So that's one book. It's a book about a whaling ship. That's what my mom told me. And then some other suggestions that I don't have yet. I don't own the books. But Siri, who you saw in one of the episodes of the Max and Dylan show, suggested I read Lisa Brennan Jobs' Small Fry. So she's Steve Jobs' daughter. Oscar from the lasagna video, you can click right there to watch that. Suggested a few books, namely Into Thin Air. I didn't write the authors down because he didn't give them to me, but Into Thin Air, and my mom said she had that book, so I might read that. Liar's Poker, and also Andre Agassi's autobiography. I'm not a huge, I think he played tennis. I think he's a tennis player. Oscar's a big tennis person. I am not, but we'll see. Maybe I'll read it, maybe not. The Handmaid's Tale. I want to read that. I've started reading it like 4 times and I've never gotten into it, but I think I should try and give it a try now that I have a book club and I read. So The Handmaid's Tale is another one. And yeah, leave your book suggestions down below. Thanks for watching. This has been a long, I think I probably rambled more in this episode than I did the last. So thanks for watching, Mom. Episode 2 of Max's Book Club. I almost said the Max and Dylan show. Max's Book Club. See you next time. Jack, can you press pause?